In this episode, we're sitting down with the rock and roll detective Jim Berkenstadt as he unravels the mystery of Jimmie Nicol in his book, The Beatle Who Vanished. Stay with us. Welcome, friends, to the 3324 podcast, your premier home, at least in my opinion and Eric's opinion as well, for everything music and movies. And I'm not going to talk too long about everything that I normally do because we want to get right to our guests. But I will say, join us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to continue the conversation about the very special guest we have in his book. We're going to drop links in the show notes, but I want to introduce right away the rock and roll detective, Jim Berkenstadt. Jim, thank you for making time to join us today. Appreciate it.
Dean, thanks very much for having me on, and thanks to Eric as well. It's great to be on your show.
Yeah, I as a Beatles fan, even and I think this story will be compelling even to someone who's not a Beatles fan or has a passing interest in rock and roll because it's not totally Beatles centric. The Beatles play a big role, but also a small role in this
That's
story.
absolutely right. Yeah. You know
Yeah.
what's
So
interesting? Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say what's interesting is that even if you're just a popular music fan, this is a story about an everyday guy who suddenly becomes a Beatle at the height of their fame, and then has to decide what to do the rest of his life after those 2 weeks are over. And it's sort of an example for people who want to understand what happens a lot in pop, which is a meteoric rise for a star, and then subsequently either a slow or very fast crash landing afterwards.
Yeah, and with meteoric rises, or when we look at rock and roll quote unquote casualties, we think Brian Wilson. We think uh,
Yeah,
Sid Barrett, Peter Green. We hear those about the people that made it and had problems handling things.
sure.
It's not often we get a story about someone who kind of made it
Yeah.
and had other opportunities and didn't, which makes it a very compelling story. And like I said, we're going to put a link in the show notes to the Amazon page to purchase the book. Absolutely check it out. I read it and was engrossed from the beginning. And then also we'll put a link to Jim's website as well, so you can see what else is going on. So before we get into that, why are you called the rock and roll detective?
Well, that's a good question. Well, for many years, I have been researching rock and roll. I think I started out principally as a Beatle historian, and I started working for George Harrison towards the end of his life as a consultant, and then have continued on with Olivia and Danny Harrison to work on various projects, including serving as historical consultant for Martin Scorsese's film George Harrison Living in the Material World. Before George passed away, he recommended to Neil Aspinall of the Beatles that they hire me for various projects, including finding the lost B-roll audio that was used by Peter Jackson ultimately to make the Get Back documentary. But I've also branched out, and over the years, I was always intrigued by lots of different rock and roll bands, and specifically, I would say classic rock era. But I've delved into heavy metal. I've done a lot of documentary work for other directors and producers, and I've written a book about the making of Nirvana's Nevermind album and why, not just how it was made, but why it was so important in the 1990s as a big album of that decade. I have another book called Mysteries in the Music, where I go look at different chapters of rock history and rock lore. And I use my prior skills as a trial attorney to interview the people involved and to get to get the records, the documents, the photos, the recordings, and get to the bottom of all these different rock and roll mysteries. For example, did the CIA kill Bob Marley or try to kill Bob Marley? Did the Beach Boys steal a song from Charles Manson? So just different things that have been floating around for years but never really solved.
Yeah.
I've broken through the myths and busted them up and brought people the truth. So I believe that expression rock and roll detective was that logo or whatever was given to me by Neil Aspinall one of the times I met him at Apple headquarters in London.
Awesome, awesome. And it looks like, it seems like you put your formidable lawyering skills to bear when it comes to research. I mean, I think that's an important skill to have, because I'm guessing, as when you put your lawyer cap on to do research, you're looking at things, hopefully, I guess logically, and
Right.
kind of, looking for information, and maybe you have to sort through some rumor or hearsay but then to delve into the truth.
Well, that, and also trying to get people years later to talk to you, and for whatever reason they might feel uncomfortable talking to you. And one example is in the Bob Marley CIA case. I wrote a way to, under the Obama administration, under Freedom of Information Act, I asked for any and all records that the CIA had on Bob Marley in 1976, the year he was shot. And they wrote back and said, we can neither confirm nor deny whether we have any records of Bob Marley at the CIA. Then under the Trump administration, he was the president after that. I wrote the same request letter and I got the same exact, buzz off letter from the CIA saying, we're not going to give you that. So then I contacted a friend of mine knew Colonel Oliver North, who was the national security advisor under Ronald Reagan. But I thought maybe he would have known Gerald Ford,
Mhm.
who is no longer with us. So I contacted him and I said, how come the government won't give me these records? And he said, that's weird because they were declassified back in the late 90s.
Hmm.
So they should have given you those records.
Yeah.
I said, so how am I going to get those records? I'm not going to spend 3, 4 years suing the government and wasting my money. And he said, oh, well, have you heard of this guy named Julian Assange? He has a website called WikiLeaks. And I said, yes, I know all about that. He goes, go there. The records are there. I guarantee it. And so that's how I found the CIA records that should be available to the public. So I don't give up. And
Yeah.
I go to whoever I need to talk to try to get the answers, because I know rock and roll fans want to know, in detail all of these things, what's true and what's not true.
Yeah, and I think for I don't want to diminish Jimmie Nicol, but for what would seemingly be a minor player in rock and roll history, that must be even more difficult, because it's not, everybody can write a book about the Beatles. There's so much information,
Right.
people can kind of take whatever angle they want on it, but you're in this case, trying to recreate a life, and digging, not, I guess from the pivot point of what he's known for, these 13 days that
Mhm.
Jimmie Nicol subbed for Ringo and the Beatles, but then what did he do before? And then what did he
Right.
do after? So, and like I said, if he wasn't a huge star, that could be a daunting task then, to find people or to locate recordings that weren't very popular at the time, and maybe try and dig up a 45, or talk to
Yeah,
somebody from way back.
absolutely. It took me, I think, probably a total of 12 years of research to flesh out this Jimmy Nichols career and life. And that's, because he only ever was in the newspapers and in the Saturday movie theater newsreels for 2 weeks. And that was it. Nothing before, nothing after. And, it's really, it was daunting because there was only ever one sentence written about him in all of Beatle history, that, Ringo got tonsillitis, went to the hospital. The tour had to go on, and they found Jimmie Nicol, and he played for 2 weeks, and then he left. That was the only information that was out there at the time. Now, if you go online, everything you see about Jimmie Nicol comes from my book. It's
Mhm.
sourced from my book, whether they give credit or not. But there was nothing on the internet, so I had to really find some old. To start off with, I had to find old artists from his time period and start asking around, hey, did you know Jimmie Nicol? And pretty quickly, I started to find old British entertainers who did know him or had played with him. And so they were very helpful. And then they would say, oh, you ought to talk to this guy. He was his tech roadie for drumming one year. And then you should talk to this guy. And at the end of each interview, I always ask, is there someone else you think I should talk to?
Mhm.
And that usually leads to something. The trouble is, once Jimmie Nicol had been a Beatle, and then within one year, He was divorced, bankrupt, and completely out of work. Uh, he walked out the door on his family and all of his friends, and those people in London said we never saw him or heard from him again. So each time he vanished in his career, I had to figure out, somehow where did he go next? And that always took about a year just to solve that one problem of where did he go next and then flesh it out again.
Yeah, and I think not only is it where did he go next, I think part of the puzzle is why. Is why
Yeah,
did why did this person make all these moves? And I think you really in the book you really kind of lay out the possibilities or based on what people had said about Jimmy that knew him,
yeah,
what he might have been thinking or or what about him led him to the decisions he made. Now, before we go any deeper, most Beatle fans or when you I think everybody goes has a Beatle phase. My Beatle phase was in the 80s. So there really wasn't, it was pre-internet. There obviously wasn't really a lot. There was a documentary called The Complete Beatles, narrated by Malcolm McDowell. I think Jimmie Nicol got like a passing, even maybe they might have mentioned his name, but it was very passing. But everybody
yeah,
knows Pete Best, everybody knows Stu Sutcliffe.
right.
But Jimmy has the distinction of being the only drummer to replace Ringo Starr and play with the Beatles after they had made their ascension
Yeah,
into the rock and roll record books. But he occupied, since it was only 13 days, he occupied such a small space that people tend to forget about him. So what about Jimmy did you find fascinating that you said I need to really
yeah.
focus in on this guy?
Well, the first thing I found was, he really started drumming very early in his life. His dad had been a drummer in the military. And so, his sticks and drums were always around the house, and Jimmy would pick those up, and he just started playing drums on his own. Uh, Back then, that was somewhat unusual. Nowadays, if you go to someone's house and there's a 2-year-old toddler, they might have a little plastic guitar, they might have a tambourine, they might have drums. But back then, that he was just fortunate that his dad had this equipment and he could just start playing it. So he started very early. Then uh, I guess what I found interesting most about him was that he was interested in many styles of music. So he loved jazz, he loved rhythm and blues, he loved rock and roll, and he loved what later came a little later, which was ska music,
Mhm.
which we know turned into reggae ultimately. And he began to experiment and practice these different types of drumming techniques for all those types of music because he could play along with records and such. So it was fascinating to me that he was so talented by the time the Beatles ever met him. He had played in big bands, which were sort of they were definitely on their way out in America, but they were still pretty popular in England in the early 60s. So played with big bands, he played with rock bands. He had already toured Italy with Tommy Steele's brother, Colin Hicks, and gotten an experience there. They recorded there, they toured. He got a real professional music experience at a very, very early age. And, even before he joined his first band, he was smart enough to work at Boozy and Hawkes as a drum repairer. And that put him in touch with lots of other musicians in the city of London, and then that led to him playing at places like the Two Eyes Coffee Shop and others, the Flamingo, etc. And so, he really was driven, very independent guy, and I found that he was very talented and long before the Beatles.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that he was from London because he was not from Liverpool, so he was not one
Right.
of the core guys. And I think for what I enjoy also about your book is for Beatles fans, we know Liverpool, Hamburg, and the Cavern Club. It's kind of like because the Beatles legend looms so large, that's pretty much what people think. But I really enjoyed reading about the Two Eyes coffee house and
Yeah.
about this London uh, music scene as well. Because, like I said,
Scene,
for
yeah.
Beatles fans, it's so big that we just always hear Liverpool, but he was out
Right.
there working, doing sessions. almost like you said, would almost seemingly play any type of music just because he wanted
Right.
to be there, he wanted to be out and playing. And yeah, like you said, by the time 1964 rolls around, and Ringo Starr, who part of my theory, or we can, hindsight's always 2020, but Ringo, we know as a youth was always prone to illness.
Hmm.
So he had gotten tonsillitis. They're on the verge of their European tour. Brian Epstein needs somebody. Can you pick it up from there? This was a last minute decision
Right.
that the whole tour hinged on. They were going to be touring Europe for the first time and Australia.
Right. Right. So, at the time, if you think about it, we didn't have the internet, and also long distance phone calls from London to Australia or London to Amsterdam or wherever, or Hong Kong. It just was cost prohibitive to use that technology of telephones even to set up a tour. There are many details that go into setting up a tour. So Brian Epstein had to send letters back and forth to promoters in all these countries. It took a year for him to pull this whole tour together. And I think that's important because of what happened. It was definitely a case of the show must go on. I went through for 10 hours in Melbourne. I went to an archive and I read all of the written documents and letters between Epstein and the promoter there. And that's when I realized, holy cow, there's so many details. Like, we have to rent backup instruments. We have to make sure there's so many rooms on one floor that's secure for the Beatles and the press and their roadies, etc. We have to have a tailor on hand in case they tear their, or whip the girls tear their clothing. So many things went into it. So all of a sudden at noon, I think it was June 2nd or 3rd of 1964, Ringo just collapsed at a photo session. And the plan was that day for the Beatles to do the photo session and then actually go to EMI, which it wasn't called Abbey Road yet, EMI Studios, and record a couple songs and then go home and pack. And the next day they were off for a world tour, their first ever world tour. So Ringo collapsed. Neil Aspinall told me that he picked him up, carried him into a car, and drove straight to the hospital. And from there, I don't think nowadays you sit in the hospital for 2 weeks with tonsillitis. But back then, that's what you did. And also, of course, you were saying Ringo was kind of a sickly kid. And so it may be that he needed a little more care. So now he comes back. Epstein comes to the Beatles and says, "Well, we have to find someone to replace Ringo and at the start of this tour." And George Harrison spoke up and said, "Well, if we're not using Ringo, then we're not the Beatles, and I'm not going to play either." So really, I think Lennon and McCartney understood the financial implications, the fact that pop stars did not have a long shelf life at that time. They could be just dumped and a new pop star would be brought in. No one knew the Beatles were going to be a real lasting legacy. And so I think Lennon and McCartney understood the need to replace the drummer, and they all convinced George that really the show must go on. Otherwise, they would have been sued by all the promoters who had sold the tickets. All these retailers around the world had stocked up on Beatle records, Beatle wigs, Beatle lunchboxes, etc. It would have been a real disaster, both legally and as a public relations, bad news thing. So, as a result, it was decided that, okay, we're going to go look for someone. Well, the first two people that they asked were both busy and had other prior commitments, and they were also older, more established drummers. So then a lot of things on the internet say, well, George Martin had worked with Jimmie Nicol, knew Jimmie Nicol. George Martin told me, I never had worked with Jimmie Nicol. We were at different studios with different record labels. He was with Pi, I was with Parlophone. We'd never worked together. I had vaguely heard his name. So then I had to really dig into who really knew Jimmie Nicol. And I found that both Paul McCartney had seen him play at the Flamingo with Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. And then I found some lost BBC footage of Brian Epstein in the studio with his other artist, Tommy Quickly. And there in the background is Jimmie Nicol tuning his drums for the session. So it really takes a lot of detailed analysis and research to find out what went on that day and why they had to go on tour without Ringo and how they came to find Jimmie Nicol. And then once they did, they asked George Martin to give him a call, and he brought him down to to EMI, and they did their tryout slash rehearsal, and they were amazed because Jimmie Nicol knew all of Ringo's drum parts.
Yeah, and there's a great story. I'll leave it for the book about why Jimmie Nicol knew all of the Beatles' parts because there was a project he worked on previous that
Mhm.
facilitated him needing to know it. But and I think it's a great part of the book that
Thank you.
kind of gets that happenstance of this guy was nowadays. I don't think you'd get to a third person asking to tour, which I thought was ironic. But again, hindsight's
Yes.
2020. We're looking at it as why are you saying no to the Beatles?
Yeah.
You said at the time it was just another group. This rock and
Yeah.
roll long hair thing, was probably a passing fad. So it's like, well, I'll stay where the money is. And
Yeah.
Jimmy actually kind of had that dilemma as well because he was kind of starting to kind of he was doing session work and he was getting gigs on a somewhat regular basis and starting to
Right.
build his resume. Uh,
Yes.
and in a
And
lot of
even,
cases, this was a blessing and a curse for him. This is really
oh,
where
absolutely.
the pivot point of Jimmy's story really takes place.
That's absolutely right. It was kind of it's a double-edged sword. When you suddenly, you've been working hard at the entertainment world, and then you're suddenly at the very top. One day, Jimmy said, one day I would walk down the streets, girls wouldn't even look at me. The next day I got out of a limousine with John, Paul, and George, and they're tearing my clothes apart. They're screaming. They're all excited, and they love me. Well, why didn't they love me the day before? But it's just an amazing phenomenon that I'm really not sure that there's any other example like this in rock and roll music history. And it's to me, it was just fascinating. And
Yeah.
then, 2 weeks later, I'm 25 years old. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? I mean, there's a great picture in the book where Jimmy is at the airport waiting for his plane, and you can see him deep in thought. It's almost like he has PTSD. That it's like, what happened? What hit me? What did I just go through? This Beatlemania thing I was a part of, and now I'm not a part. And now what do I do?
Yeah,
So,
and so much so that they didn't even make suits for him. He had to wear Ringo's clothing and try and fit.
right,
He was a little bit beefier than Ringo and had
he
to
was.
kind of fit in. So this was that spur of the moment. That was like at the 11th hour, literally before this tour is about to commence, they needed to get somebody in there and he filled in.
He
And
didn't even, excuse me a second, he didn't even own a suitcase or have a passport at that point in time. He had to borrow a suitcase from one of his fellow session people, a singer, and then Mal Evans took care of getting him a passport. Imagine today trying to get a passport in under 24 hours.
never,
Impossible.
never. But the Beatles machine can
Yeah,
certainly at that time get it done.
that's
Now he
right.
was paid, and he was paid two ways. He was paid money. He was paid £500, I believe, right? And then he was, well, and there's some dispute about that, right? There was
Some
also
dispute about
how
what
much
he's
money.
paid. Or some people say 2,500 pounds,
Yeah.
the papers. So,
But he was also given a gold watch, and the watch, I'm going to dangle that for everybody to read the book. The
yeah,
watch plays a part in this story as
yeah.
well. He was given the watch by Brian Epstein as a thank you, and it's engraved on the back. And it was something that Jimmy also maybe had a love-hate relationship with because it was a constant reminder once he came back to quote unquote reality. That's really kind of where the trouble started. Although, Jim, in the book, you detail that they had things set up for him. They were some I think Pi Records or it
Yes.
was planning on capitalizing on this because he had a group before this that was kind of in the makings, and they're like, okay, this fifth Beatle is coming back. We're going to be able to kind of capitalize, and that's kind of what Jimmy was looking forward. He thought, okay, I'm now on the fast lane.
Yes. And I think he honestly felt that he could take his band, which was called Jimmie Nicol and the Shub Dubs, which I would not call a great name for a band. But I think he honestly felt that he could compete, on the record charts and in the concert halls with the Beatles and other big bands of the day, the Rolling Stones. In fact, he appeared on Top of the Pops, his band, shortly after the Beatles stint, and they were on the same program as the Rolling Stones that day. So I think he really honestly thought, hey, I'm in the big leagues now. And in 2 weeks' time, I went from, basically unknown to the public, and now I'm the fifth Beatle wherever I go. What I think he didn't maybe realize is that, well, a couple things. One, it's tough to be a band leader in the back, of the stage as the drummer. You really need to be out front as a singer at a minimum, and singer guitar player would be even better. And I mean, one more modern day example is Dave Grohl was the drummer for Nirvana, and he realized he had to come out front when he formed Foo Fighters, and he did. He played guitar and was very successful then. But I don't think he would have been successful had he just been a drummer in the Foo Fighters and they just had some unknown person singing, and that's what Jimmie Nicol did. The other factor, I think, is that what many people don't realize when they are suddenly famous or in the news a lot is that that's only in a short news cycle, and then it's all forgotten. So really by say September, October of 1964, Jimmy was no longer a big story in the newspapers. As that happens, fewer and fewer people are going to come to your concerts. And when that happens, you're going to be playing in smaller and smaller venues. And then at that point, he couldn't afford these expensive session players to keep them on the road. They had to go back to doing sessions in order to earn a good living.
Yeah, and he certainly his mindset was he was not going to just go back to doing what he was doing before. And
Right.
like I said, we can play Monday morning quarterback and question
Mhm.
all of, knowing what we know now about everything that happened in the 60s could,
Yeah.
and I think you make I think in the addendum to the book, when you update things, I think there's a mention of Jimmy Page and the
Yeah.
session work that Page was doing, and how if Jimmy Nicol had maybe stayed the course when he came back,
Yeah.
there was those opportunities. But again, we're looking at it through a different lens.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and he's
Monday
and they're
morning.
looking at it as, yeah, I need money, I need to make a living.
Mhm.
This is, and he kept on. He always had the hope that this one event that happened would. He actually got multiple shots at it. I mean, he
Yeah.
actually got multiple bites at the apple. We're not going to go too far because I want to save it, but in the
Okay.
60s, he certainly did. When he did disappear from England, he really didn't disappear. He actually got an opportunity that seemed was he was very happy with, at least for a short term.
Yeah. And he was a full-time member, not a temporary member. And he also got more experience in the studio as a producer or helping to co-produce with the band, and they even had a number one hit in Japan while he was with them. So you're right, he did. He tried very hard, and he really, was a good band member. He was a good leader. He was a very friendly guy. And I think that carried him well. And then when he was a stranger, he would pull out that gold watch you mentioned, and it would sort of help him with some sort of cachet or credibility, because people would go, "Well, who are you?" And he goes, "Well, I played with the Beatles. Look, here's my watch."
Yeah, and,
Interesting.
and that group he played with was the Spotniks, which were
Right.
an instrumental European group of the 60s, much like the American Ventures or the Shadows
Right.
from England,
From
that were
England. Yeah.
played with Cliff Richard first, and then they kind of branched out on their own. So he was. I also get the feeling. because it comes up in the book that he was also maybe hoping that Ringo wouldn't come back, not in a bad way, but hey, if this, if Ringo is ill or he can't return, I can become a Beatle. And
Mhm.
that seems to be a recurring theme, but everything I'm reading about him, I don't know that he would have been happy there as well because he seemed like a restless person. And the
Yes,
Beatles, if he was in the Beatles, it would have been in a lesser role, and he had always dreamed of leading, right? Like I said, being the guy with the name on top. So do you
right.
think had he gotten his wish, I think it would have been a poison pill for him because even then he was getting tired of how he said being boxed in of the Beatle
Yeah,
experience, even though that would change later on. But at the time we didn't know that.
I think you're right. I think that let's say Ringo was so ill he could not come back, hypothetically, and let's say they grabbed Jimmie Nicol. I really think he would have only stuck around for a year or so because he was very restless. He was doing very well with the Spotniks for 2, 3 years, and then he got restless again. And I just think that he was a hardworking guy and he wanted to be on the top, but sometimes he just couldn't stick with a particular band or particular series of situations, and he just had to keep moving on. And that's obviously his choice. It was his life.
Yeah, he seemed like a very restless soul, but
Point.
in the aspect of always trying different things. He
Yeah,
went from
right.
from big band music to Beatle music to then
Mhm.
instrumental. Really,
Yeah.
I was watching some of the Spotnik's videos on YouTube, and it's a very particular type of music. And then in the '70s, we'll kind of cut off his adventures there. But in the
Okay.
'70s, he traveled to Mexico and
Yeah.
ended up making a totally different kind of very avant-garde style, or
Yeah.
attempting to make a very avant-garde style of music.
That's right. Kind of a little psychedelic album there with a friend that he had met there named Eddie Quinn, and they called themselves Los Nickel Quinn, the Nickel Quinn. And it was also interesting because he was getting into hanging out with other avant-garde artists in Mexico City. So he ended up writing soundtracks for experimental films, movies in Mexico. That I've been able to see a couple of them, and they're interesting. And I just remember there was one scene where we hear Jimmie's music and there's a naked woman on her stomach and he's playing not he, but somebody's playing bongos on this woman's behind while we're listening to Jimmie's music. And I'm like, that is pretty far out there. But nothing was too much for him. He wanted to try everything. He also taught music theory in Mexico City, and he appeared on the radio a little bit there. So, and he owned a button factory in Mexico City while he was there. And for the longest time, I thought, you know, a button factory, and I'm looking at these buttons on my shirt, and then finally, I found someone who had a friend who had worked at the button factory, and he said, no, it wasn't shirt buttons. It was political buttons like peace and love and yellow submarine. And he would have some Beatle buttons made and such. So they were just fun buttons for people to wear, which if you were alive in the late 60s, early 70s, you saw a lot of young people wearing buttons to express their views on things.
Yeah, and it wasn't. And I think the picture I got from your book is it wasn't for lack of trying. I mean, he did try different genres and different things, and if I go here, maybe things will be different. But it just seems like
Huh.
it's unfortunately not in the cards for everybody, despite
Mhm.
everybody's best efforts. And that's probably the tragic part of this is that he did ascend to that peak very quickly. Now,
Mhm.
he also kind of blamed Brian Epstein for things.
Yeah,
In my opinion, I'll ask you to tell the story. In my opinion, it was a very innocuous event that happened,
yeah.
but he seemed to use that as like the linchpin for why things didn't work out for him. But can you kind of just briefly kind of tell us about the very few interactions he had with Brian? But this was at the
Sure.
end of the tour.
Right. At the end of the tour, Brian came back, I think it was the 14th. He came back with Ringo Starr, who is now healthy. And now there were five Beatles up on the balcony waving to the fans. And then they put all five of them with the two drummers at a table for the press conference. Well, during the press conference, the four original Beatles were sort of pretty much huddled together and they were just excited. You know, they were trying to get close to Ringo because they just were so happy to have him back. Jimmie was sort of off to the side and this might be on YouTube. There's video from that tour, but I had found video of him and he's off to the side and you know they all have live microphones. Most of the questions were going to Ringo or John and Paul at that point, and Jimmie's microphone was live. It was live, and so he started having a side conversation with a reporter about what are you going to do when you get back home, and obviously that went out to the crowd, and it was making it difficult for these reporters to hear what the other Beatles were saying, and this enraged not only Brian Epstein but also Derek Taylor because they felt this was just rude behavior. And so when the press conference ended, I spoke with an eyewitness who saw Brian Epstein dress down Jimmie quite, you know, angrily, saying, you know, that was really rude, and go to your room and pack, you know, and we'll take you to the airport tomorrow. But you know, you shouldn't have talked when it wasn't your turn to talk. And this was the drummer for Sounds Incorporated who I interviewed, and he had seen this. So Jimmie went to his room for a while, but then, you know, as the evening went on and the Beatles were having their usual big party in their suite, Jimmie didn't attend. Instead, he got in a taxi and went to a bar and was just having drinks. And Brian Epstein's like, "Where's Jimmie Nicol?" And they're like, "Oh, well, I think Mal Evans knew," and said, "Yeah, he went to this bar." So he sent Brian sent Neil and Mal to go get Jimmie and bring him back. And it's really funny because I talked to Neil about this later, and I said, "What was that like?" And he said, "It was kind of funny." And you know, he said, "We went there, and Jimmie's like, 'What are you doing here?' And we said, 'Well, Brian wants you to come back,' you know, and Brian wanted to control all situations related to the Beatles so that no bad event would happen that would harm their publicity and harm their career. So Jimmie said, "Well, why do I have to go back? I'm not a Beatle anymore." And, and Neil said, you know, quoting Brian, he said, "You are a Beatle until we put you on that airplane." So again, that annoyed Jimmie, who was a very independent person. He felt like Epstein had it out for him. So when he gets back to England and things are going great, Brian Epstein actually uh, put Jimmie on the bill with the Beatles at an event, which is a very nice thing to do. That was a big thank you. Besides the money and besides giving him the watch before he got him on the plane. But as things didn't work out for Jimmie with the Shub Dubs and his next group, The Sound of Jimmie Nicol, he began to believe that he was being blacklisted by Brian Epstein. And I believe that this came from his previous experience. Jimmie was in a band called Vince Eager and the Quiet Three in the early 60s. And Larry Parnes was the big Brian Epstein in the early days, the first real rock promoter in England. And Larry did blacklist Vince Eager over disagreements, and Vince couldn't play, be on TV, get in a concert hall or anything for 2 years. And I think that seeing that happen, and that actually was a real blacklisting. I think that was in the back of Jimmie's mind when he had these two little skirmishes with Brian, which, you know, as we've said, weren't really that big a deal. But later on, when I interviewed his wife, who he married in Mexico, she said, "Yeah, it was really interesting. He really felt that when things didn't go right, that it was Brian Epstein's fault." And you know, I don't think that was a realistic way to handle, you know, issues not going your way. But
Yeah, and
nevertheless, that was what he did.
yeah,
It's very
and I think,
interesting.
yeah, I think looking at it, I mean, I think Brian Epstein had his hands full with the Beatles,
Yeah,
and in my opinion, didn't give this incident more than a passing thought. Not enough to, because he didn't do, there was no damage done. So in my
right.
opinion, it's kind of like no harm, no foul. If had something happened, maybe I think you could make a case for it, but I still think Brian was so busy with maintaining the image of the Beatles and just
Right.
doing everything because they were so busy at that point that
Yeah,
yeah, this,
that's right.
it he's yeah, for him I could see how it's built, it could be like, well, what did I do wrong? How could this be
Yeah,
all be happening? Well, there's only one thing that went wrong, and it was this, and it was with this person, and
yeah,
he's very powerful, so I've got a way to, an out to kind of blame things on when things don't go my way.
right. But I spoke with Tony Bramwell and Neil Aspinall both before they died, and they said no, there was no blacklisting, there was no ill will. In fact, Brian and all of us were very grateful to Jimmy for saving the world tour. We were grateful and enjoyed his company, and that Brian, they said not only did Brian never do anything directly to harm Jimmy, he actually tried to help him a couple times. And of course, and so Paul and George also tried to help Jimmy along the way. So I think it was just sort of in his head, unfortunately.
Yeah, and as we start to wind up, I think that's where I was kind of going to, and you already went there. Is Paul McCartney was a little bit of an angel on his shoulder, unbeknownst to Jimmy.
Mhm.
I believe there was one point where Jimmy was struggling, and Paul McCartney anonymously donated some money to him. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know about a donation, but he did, he called Peter Asher,
Yeah, that's
and Peter and Gordon hired Jimmy for some shows and also for some recordings, although Peter can't recall which particular songs he did. He played drums on some Peter and Gordon songs, so he made some money in the summer of '65 there. And and when I was in communication with Georgie Fame, Georgie was definitely upset that Jimmy did not come back to his band and kind of left him in a lurch without a drummer. Plus, he was a great drummer for that style of R&B music. Uh, so Paul spoke to him and said, "Hey, could you maybe just have him fill in when when you have a sick drummer or whatever?" So even Georgie Fame brought him back briefly now and then, and then at some point Jimmy left the country. So Paul did make efforts, and then zoom ahead to the anthology. Paul wanted to have Jimmy do some on-screen narration of his time with the Beatles because that was part of their whole history. And he asked Jimmy's son, and it just so happens that Jimmy's son was a recording engineer for that movie. And he found out that this was Jimmie Nicol's son. He said, "Would you ask your dad if he, would be on?" Now, again, he would have been paid a good sum of money to come on and talk about it. And Jimmy just said simply no. So
yeah,
again, Paul was reaching out, trying to help him.
yeah, and there was a phrase that Jimmy would use, I believe, when I guess when the other Beatles would ask Jimmy,
Mhm.
"Hey, how you doing? How you holding up?" And he would
Yeah,
say, "It's getting better."
right.
Now, does that figure into Paul McCartney as well? I think you
Yeah,
posit a little theory about, well, that sounds like a popular Beatles tune, doesn't it?
yeah. Well, clearly, and I talk about the origin of that song and in the book and how Paul was influenced by that expression. And even if you watch the Get Back documentary, you'll see mentions of Paul's talking about, well, Ringo doesn't want to go away to another country to play a tour, so maybe we'll get Jimmie Nicol. So it's really interesting that Paul, I think, really enjoyed him. I also, in speaking with the Harrison family, they said once George got over the fact that Jimmy was going to have to take over for a while, he was one of the first people to really take Jimmy under his wing and help him. And that was also confirmed by a reporter who I talked to who went on, Don Short, who went on tour with the band for part of the first leg of the world tour. So they all really liked him. Uh,
Yeah, they
so
seem to. Yeah, I get the
and they
impression
appreciate it.
in your writings, yeah, that they accepted him as one because he also proved himself. He was a very capable drummer, able to because he knew the material,
Right.
was able to slide in quite easily into it. Um, I still can't imagine what it would be for 13 days of that's more that's like a whirlwind. That's almost like
Right.
not it's not like you were there for a year or a few months. 2 weeks really is being foisted into the public eye so quickly, having everything at your beck and call, and then having it literally taken away. So,
Yeah.
we can certainly understand anybody would struggle with that.
Right. I mean,
I
it's
think.
a really interesting human interest story beyond just the whole Beatle thing. And that's why it's being made into a film, a feature film, is because they just really like the human interest angle. It just happens to be set in a time where someone got to be a Beatle for 2 weeks and how he dealt with that in his life. But it's really an interesting case of an everyday guy, and then he gets to the top of the mountain way too quickly, and then it's sort of like the rug's pulled out from under him right away. And how do you deal with that meteoric rise, and then not necessarily a crash, but just a change of life circumstances where you have
Yeah,
to really work hard to move ahead.
yeah, literally a return to reality. Now, since you said it's being uh, made into a movie, do you have a casting wish for who to play Jimmie Nicol? Is there someone in your mind when obviously there's been conversation, so I'm sure in your
Right.
mind you're thinking, well, who would I cast in this?
I don't really have a selection for young Jimmy,
Uh-huh.
but I have seen these pictures of older Jimmy, and I think that Jim Carrey actually looks in many ways like the older Jimmie Nicol, and he could certainly play that part of the film if they decided they probably will decide they need to break it up into two different Jimmie Nicol actors. But I once you option the film, you can have creative input,
Yes.
but not creative control as an author. And so, you know, I know that a lot of authors are a pain in the butt with movie companies,
Mm.
and I'm just the opposite. What I said to them was, I write books, you make movies. You're expert at that. I'm an expert at books. You do your thing, and if you need me for help, I'm there to help you and answer any questions. And they're like, "Oh, you don't know what a relief this is."
No meddling author who wants to
No,
look at
but like,
every,
author,
send me
what's
the
that
script,
like?
send me the script for approval and change this, and you
Yeah,
didn't
I
you said
mean,
it this way.
I want to see those
Yeah.
things just for fun. I want to be part of that process,
Yeah.
but I want to be able to contribute when they ask me. But I certainly don't want to be a barrier or a problem.
Yeah. That's awesome, Jim. It really is. And as a because this is the 60th anniversary of this event with Jimmie Nicol joining the tour, you have actually added to the book. You've added some an addendum at the end, kind of an epilogue of what you've learned since you originally wrote the book, and there's some great information in there as well. So not only are you getting the story as Jim researched it and wrote it. But then
Right.
after that, there's which I really enjoyed was this little extra thing of now all of a sudden people started coming out of the woodwork. Where were you when I needed you? Right?
All
Uh,
right.
kind of coming out and say and enhancing it and enriching the story as well. So,
Yeah.
Jim, I think this book was very compelling. It was a great read of the early days of rock and roll from not from the fame and fortune story. We know the meteoric rise of the Beatles, or not so meteoric. They actually did a lot of work as well. But
You
to
did.
see this from someone who did kind of touch the sun for a brief moment, and then what happens afterwards, and how do you
Yeah.
handle that? I think you did a masterful job. And like I said, we're going to put a link in the show notes for
Thank
everybody
you.
to pick up this book and read it because it really is a mystery. And as you go through, you're kind of waiting for, well, what's going to happen? And he keeps doing things that make himself vanish and disappear.
Right.
And is he really gone? And is he really alive or dead? And I'm going to leave
Right.
that for, for the reader.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the compliment. I appreciate it. It was it, it was a labor of love. I wanted to fill in a an empty piece of Beatle history, but then I also then discovered there was so much more interesting, aspects to this person's life than just being a Beatle for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
accomplished quite a bit.
Yeah, and like I said, there's so much that goes on, and the research is exhaustive. There's a discography at the end as well. So if people want to do some more hunting and listen to some of the recordings and kind of hear it,
By
you've
the
given
way,
everybody
yeah,
a great volume of information.
if people want to not have to search for old dusty 45s, I went on Spotify and created a playlist of some of his songs, maybe about 15 Jimmie Nicol recordings throughout his career. So if you search Spotify under Jimmie Nicol, Jimmie Nicol, The Beatle Who Vanished, you will see a great song list.
Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll make it easy. I'll go and get that link and we'll put it in the show notes. And this way,
Thanks,
you're
Dean.
going to get the whole thing. You can visit Jim's website, you can purchase his book, and then you can also check out the Spotify playlist as well. Jim Berkenstadt, thank you so much for taking the time uh, to talk and fill in our listeners about this person. Again, the Beatles cast a wide shadow and looming over everything in music. But this one small event that happened to this person changed his life one way or the other. We can have that conversation, but it makes for a compelling read and really a rock and roll mystery. And the rock and roll detective has sorted it all out for us. All you have to do is grab the book and check it out. Jim Berkenstadt, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Dean. I really enjoyed it. Great questions, too. I
Oh,
really enjoyed our conversation.
thanks. And that's going to do it for this episode of the 3324 podcast. You can continue the conversation on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, ask questions, check out the episode, check out the book. If you've got questions and I can get them to Jim, I will certainly do that if possible. And that's going to do it. So for Jim, this has been Dean, and we'll catch you on the flip side.